connection between matter and consciousness. This is very important question, and I try to deal this question in a phenomenological manner. And this goes well together with when I was talking about the stages of yoga, these 8 stages. And I got to pranayama, and then our discussion went to somewhere else. But the next step of there is pratyahara, which is normally understood as the withdrawal from the senses. And what that actually means is, in my interpretation of these stages of yoga, of Patanjali, is that when you go to the pranayama and you start to expand the breath or control of the breath, and you go deeper and deeper into the breath practice, and you just follow the breath or whatever you do with the breath, that automatically withdraws us from the senses, from the sense objects, because breath itself is not a connection to the objects, the sense objects, or the material world, but it connects us with the atmosphere or the aerial world, which is not at all an object. It's not matter in that kind of sense that we can grasp it like I grasp a glass, or I grasp my shirt, or I grasp my head, or shake hands with other person, or manipulate objects. And this is what we normally understand as matter. Of course, there are very different kind of concepts of matter and consciousness. But if we deal this question, for example, when Joe was asking what is primordial, is consciousness primordial, or is matter primordial, and what emerges from what? Does matter emerge from consciousness, or does consciousness emerge from matter? And then there was also from the person who asked from one of the listeners, does the matter create consciousness, or does the consciousness create matter, which is very similar question to what Joe was asking. So if we ask this question phenomenologically, experientially, and then we connect it with this yoga practice of these 8 stages, and then we get from pranayama to pratyahara, to withdrawal from senses, there happens, we are actually experientially dealing with this question. We are phenomenologically dealing this question of connection between consciousness and matter. And if we understand matter as the material objects that our senses are connected with, and we understand consciousness as that relating with the world, or our way of, the consciousness has very different kind of levels. We have theoretical consciousness, we have practical consciousness, we have social consciousness, we have perceptual consciousness. For example, seeing something is a perceiving of something. Consciousness, here important idea of consciousness, which is phenomenological idea, is that consciousness is always consciousness of something. It's impossible to just be conscious. One is always conscious of something. And here, some of the spiritual people then will say, but samadhi or enlightenment is not consciousness of something. It is consciousness when consciousness is conscious of itself. This is one of their ways of describing this kind of spiritual experience. But here it is important now to understand that when we go to the breath practice of pranayama, which is then at the same time withdrawal from the senses or the sense objects or sensual matter, we are then going to that purely conscious relation where we are not anymore conscious of the matters or conscious of objects, but our breath, through our breath, respiratory consciousness, we are becoming conscious only of that immense atmosphere, which is not anymore object consciousness. And there comes phenomenologically the key point of how to understand this relation between consciousness and matter is that when we withdraw from the senses, then this material world starts to little by little withdraw from our experience. And we start to experience the world or become conscious and aware of reality or the world, which is not limited by our material objects around us, because we get connected experientially with that atmosphere, which is limitless. It is it doesn't have limits like objects have always limits. And that going deeper and deeper into that kind of expansion becomes the spiritual experience when you start to feel that comes inside you and you start to relate and exchange that kind of vast, immense atmosphere. There, that could be understood as the experience of God. It's good to remember that as Jesus describes in the Gospel of John, that God is pneuma, breath or air. Wow,
that is incredible. Like, I have really never heard anybody really connect the dots between, the practices and the consciousness and what exactly is that we're going into. Like, that is just really beautiful how you explained it. It's like we experience it, and yet it does kind of feel like magic. And, it's just an amazing thing to think about, that we can actually, what does that mean to pull away into consciousness, that state of pure consciousness, to experience Atman or God? Like, what exactly is it that we are experiencing, experience without an object?
Well, that's nice to hear that it sounded good.